What if the Anunnaki weren't searching for gold when they descended to Earth, but for something they had already lost? What if the Great Pyramids of Giza, those monuments we've convinced ourselves were built by pharaohs, were never tombs at all, but recovery sites, libraries, vaults, places where knowledge older than Sumerian civilization still waits in darkness, sealed beneath limestone that has kept its silence for 5,000 years? Beneath the sands of 2 continents, clay tablets and hieroglyphic inscriptions still preserve fragments of a memory that refuses to stay buried. Records of beings who measured time in epochs, who built before humans wrote, who left behind structures we cannot replicate and instructions we can no longer fully decode. The message was urgent once. Now it rests in museum basements and sealed chambers, waiting for someone to recognize what it has been saying all along. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you're drawn to histories that question what we think we know about the world before our world. And if you're still here, tell me where you are and what time it is. I want to imagine this quiet stretching across the globe, connecting listeners in the dark as the past whispers through the present. Chapter 1. The Tablet That Should Not Exist. In the basement archives of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, behind climate-controlled glass in a storage room rarely visited by anyone other than cataloguing staff, there rests a clay tablet no larger than a modern paperback book, its surface covered in the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script pressed into wet clay sometime around 2100 BC and fired hard to resist the passage of millennia. The tablet is catalogued as IM 78534, and it was discovered in Neo3 during the University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur, that ancient Sumerian city whose temple libraries once held the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization. The excavation team, led by John Henry Haynes and later Hermann Hilprecht, recovered thousands of tablets from the ruins of Nippur, most of them containing exactly what scholars expected to find: administrative records, temple inventories, hymns to the gods, mathematical exercises, and geographical texts describing the known world of ancient Mesopotamia. But IM 78534 was different. When Hilprecht first attempted to translate the tablet, he noted in his journal that certain passages seemed corrupted, that the geographical descriptions did not correspond to any known Mesopotamian territory, that the scribe appeared to have made errors in copying from an older source he did not fully understand. Hilprecht set the tablet aside, intending to return to it later, but he never did, and for nearly a century IM 78534 remained in storage, occasionally mentioned in catalogue updates but never subjected to the rigorous analysis applied to more obviously significant texts. It was not until 1987 that a graduate student named Sarah Hoffman, working on a comprehensive survey of Nippur geographical texts, pulled the tablet from storage and began a systematic translation that would eventually appear as an appendix to her doctoral dissertation, buried in academic obscurity but containing observations that should have rewritten the history of ancient knowledge. What Hoffman found was a geographical text describing a journey, not through Mesopotamia, but through a land the scribe called the Territory of the Western Waters, a place where the Great River flows toward the North Star, where mountains of white stone rise from the desert in shapes that touch the realm of heaven. The description is unmistakable to anyone familiar with Egyptian geography. The Nile is the only major river in the ancient world that flows northward. The white limestone of the Giza plateau is visible for miles across the desert, and the shapes that touch the realm of heaven, well, there is only one set of structures in Egypt that has ever matched that description. Hoffman noted these correlations in her dissertation, but she framed them carefully, suggesting that the text might represent Sumerian contact with travellers who had visited Egypt, or perhaps a confused copying of multiple geographical traditions onto a single tablet. She did not propose what the text seemed to imply, because to propose it would have ended her academic career before it began. But the text does not read like a traveller's account. It reads like a survey, a precise geographical description that includes distances measured in the Sumerian unit called the baru, approximately 10 kilometers, and orientations given in relation to the rising and setting positions of specific stars. The scribe was not recording hearsay, he was copying coordinates. The tablet describes the territory of the Western Waters as containing a structure called in Sumerian the Ekur-gal, which translates directly as the Great Mountain, house. The term Ekur appears throughout Sumerian literature as a designation for temples, ziggurats, and sacred structures that serve as dwelling places for the gods. but the modifier gal indicates something of exceptional size, something beyond the ordinary scale of human construction. And the text specifies that this great mountain house stands at a location that can be calculated from the positions of 3 stars, the star of Anu in the north, the star of Enlil at the zenith, and the star of Enki at the southern horizon. These are not random celestial references. Anu, Enlil and Enki are the 3 primary Anunnaki, the supreme triad of the Sumerian pantheon, and their associated stars form a triangular configuration that, when mapped onto the night sky of 2100 BC, points to a latitude and longitude that falls within a few kilometers of the Giza plateau. The mainstream archaeological response to such correlations has been consistent and predictable. Coincidence. Scribal error. Misinterpretation by modern scholars projecting their own expectations onto ambiguous ancient texts. These explanations are not unreasonable, and they reflect the appropriate caution of a discipline that has learned through painful experience to distrust sensational claims. The history of archaeology is littered with hoaxes, with wishful interpretations, with careers destroyed by overreach. Scholars are trained to assume the simplest explanation, and the simplest explanation for a Sumerian text that appears to describe Egypt is that the translator has misunderstood the Sumerian, or that the scribe was working from garbled sources, or that the similarities are superficial patterns imposed by the modern mind on ancient chaos. But here is where the problem becomes uncomfortable. IM 78534 is not unique. Over the past century, scholars working in Mesopotamian archives have identified at least 17 other tablets containing geographical descriptions that do not match any known Mesopotamian territory. Some describe lands to the east beyond the mountains where structures of precisely cut stone rise in stepped formations. Some describe territories to the south, crosswaters that cannot be the Persian Gulf, where the sun strikes the earth with unbearable heat and the land itself seems to burn. Some describe locations to the west, where great stone monuments stand in desert silence, maintained by priests who served gods with unfamiliar names. Each of these tablets has been individually dismissed. Corrupted text, mythological geography, symbolic descriptions of the underworld or the realm of the gods. But when you gather them together, when you map the descriptions against the known world, a pattern emerges that is very difficult to explain as coincidence. The Sumerians appear to have possessed geographical knowledge of regions they should never have visited, structures they should never have seen, territories that official history says they could not have, known existed. The term they used for pyramid-like structures is particularly revealing. The Sumerian word for a stepped temple platform is ziggurat, derived from the verb zakaru, meaning to build high or to raise up. But the texts describing the Western territories use a different term, shur, which translates literally as the place of the rising, or perhaps the structure of ascension. This term appears in only a handful of texts, always in connection with distant lands, and always describing monuments of exceptional size and sacred significance. Egyptologists have long noted that the Egyptian word for pyramid, mr, carries similar connotations of ascension, of rising, of the journey from earth to heaven. The linguistic parallel is striking, but it becomes genuinely disturbing when you realize that the Sumerian texts using shur predate the earliest Egyptian pyramids by several centuries according to a conventional chronology. Either the Sumerians invented a term for a structure that did not yet exist, or the structures existed before the official timeline says they did, or the Sumerians and Egyptians were both drawing on an older vocabulary, an older tradition, an older knowledge that predated both of their civilizations. The question that emerges from IM 78534 and its companion text is not primarily archaeological, it is epistemological. How did they know? If Sumerian scribes in 2100 BC were recording precise geographical descriptions of structures on the Giza plateau, structures that conventional dating places at roughly 2500 BC, then either the chronology is wrong or the Sumerians possessed means of long-distance knowledge transmission that we have not acknowledged, or both civilizations were working from sources older than themselves. The tablet does not answer this question. It simply preserves it, fired into clay, waiting in museum storage for someone to take seriously what it seems to say. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of IM 78534 is not what it describes, but how it describes it. The text is not presented as revelation, as myth, as sacred narrative. It is presented as reference material, as geographical data, as the kind of information a scribe might consult when planning a journey or calculating distances. The tone is bureaucratic, almost boring in its precision. Whoever wrote this text, or whoever composed the original from which this text was copied, was not trying to inspire wonder. They were trying to record information they believed to be factual, information they expected would be useful to future readers who might need to know where certain structures stood and how to find them. That casual confidence in knowledge that should not exist is what makes the tablet genuinely disturbing. The scribe did not think he was writing anything remarkable. He was simply copying what he had been taught, preserving coordinates that had been passed down through generations of scribal training, maintaining a geographical database that stretched far beyond the borders of his own civilization. And if one tablet contained such information, if 17 tablets contained fragments of the same impossible knowledge, then we must ask what else the archives preserve that we have not yet recognized. What other descriptions wait in museum basements for scholars willing to take seriously what the ancients wrote? The chapter closes here, but the question remains open. If the Sumerians possessed accurate knowledge of Egyptian geography, if they could describe the pyramids in technical terms before the pyramids were supposed to exist, if they recorded coordinates that point to the Giza plateau with astronomical precision, then the story we tell ourselves about the separate development of ancient civilizations begins to crack. Something connected these cultures, something transmitted knowledge across distances that should have been impassable. And the most disturbing possibility, the one the texts themselves seem to suggest, is that both civilizations were inheriting information from a source older than either of them, a source that had mapped the Earth before human history began. Chapter 2: When the Anunnaki Measured the Earth. The Sumerians left behind a concept that has no precise equivalent in modern thought, a category of existence they called the Me, a term that scholars have translated variously as divine powers, fundamental principles, cultural norms, or cosmic decrees. The Me were not abstractions in the way we understand abstract concepts. They were treated as real things, objects almost, that could be possessed, transferred, stolen, and restored. In the mythology, the goddess Inanna famously tricks the god Enki into giving her the Me of civilization, and she carries them physically in a boat back to her city of Uruk, where they become the foundation of urban culture. The list of Me preserved in various tablets includes over 100 distinct elements: kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, the art of metalworking, the art of writing, sexual intercourse, the kindling of fire, the craft of the builder, and crucially for our purposes, search the Me of measurement, the Me of the surveyor, the Me of establishing boundaries. These were not skills that humans developed through trial and error. They were powers that existed before humanity and were bestowed upon humanity by the Anunnaki, the council of great gods who governed the cosmos before mortals took their place in the administration of Earth. The Me of measurement appears in several Sumerian texts as a divine prerogative of the highest importance. The god Enlil, chief of the Anunnaki, is frequently described as the one who measures heaven and earth, who establishes the coordinates of the cosmos, who determines where the boundaries of the world shall be fixed. His epithets include the one who holds the measuring line and the lord of the surveyor, titles that sound almost mundane until you realize what they imply. If Enlil measures heaven and earth, if measurement is a divine power that precedes human civilization, then the precise positioning of sacred sites is not a human achievement. It is a divine inheritance, coordinates established before the first human king took his throne, locations marked by beings who possess technological capabilities we can barely recognize, let alone replicate. The concept that binds heaven and earth appears throughout Sumerian religious architecture in a phrase that has puzzled scholars for generations: Dur-an-ki, which translates as the bond of heaven and earth, or the place where heaven and earth are connected. Ziggurats, those stepped temple platforms that rose above every major Sumerian city, were built as Dur-an-ki, as physical locations where the cosmic realms intersected, where the Anunnaki could descend from heaven and where properly prepared humans could potentially ascend. The architecture was not arbitrary. The orientations, the proportions, the precise positioning of these structures followed rules that the texts describe as having been established in the beginning, before human memory, before human history, when the gods walked openly upon the earth. And here is where the uncomfortable question returns. If the Anunnaki established dur and key locations across the ancient world, if they measured and marked sacred sites according to a cosmic plan that predated human civilization, then the Great Pyramids of Giza would represent perhaps the most significant dur and key of all, the bond of heaven and earth at the centre of the world, positioned with astronomical precision that modern engineers struggle to explain, oriented to cardinal directions with accuracy that exceeds what conventional archaeology believes was possible with Bronze Age technology. The texts are frustratingly imprecise about exactly how the Anunnaki perform their measurements, but they are remarkably specific about the results. One tablet from the Temple Library at Eridu, catalogued as AO 6020 and now housed in the Louvre, contains a fragmentary text describing what scholars have called a mythological geography, a description of the world as the gods knew it before humans inherited the earth. The text describes the world as a disk floating on the cosmic waters, with specific locations marked as ARU, a term that literally means stone markers or boundary monuments. These ARU are described as having been placed at the four corners of the world and at the centre, forming a geometric pattern that the gods could use to orient themselves when travelling between heaven and planet Earth. The locations are not named in the surviving fragment, but the geometrical relationships are described in mathematical terms that a modern surveyor would recognise. Angular relationships given in degrees that correspond to the Sumerian sexagesimal system, distances measured in baru, positions defined by their relationship to the apparent motion of specific stars. If you attempt to reconstruct the pattern from the fragmentary data, if you assume that the centre point corresponds to a location of exceptional geographical significance, you arrive at a configuration that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The centre falls near the geographical centre of the ancient world as the Sumerians would have known it, roughly equidistant from the eastern mountains and the western waters, from the northern territories and the southern reaches of the known world. This centre is not in Mesopotamia, it is in Egypt. It is, within the margin of error that fragmentary ancient texts allow, the location of the Giza plateau. The mathematical correlations between Sumerian city placements and Egyptian monument positions have been noted by researchers operating outside mainstream academia, and their work is typically dismissed as numerology, as the inevitable result of searching for patterns in large datasets until some pattern emerges by chance. This criticism is not unfounded. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and we can find significant appearing correlations in any sufficiently complex dataset if we look hard enough. But the correlations between Sumer and Egypt resist easy dismissal because they are not random. They follow specific mathematical relationships that would have meaning within the Sumerian measurement system, relationships based on the sexagesimal number system that the Sumerians used for everything from astronomy to architecture. The distance between the Ziggurat of Ur and the Great Pyramid of Giza, measured along the surface of the Earth, is approximately 1,050 kilometres. This seems like a random number until you convert it to baru, the Sumerian unit of distance approximately equal to 10.8 kilometres. In baru, the distance is almost exactly 125 units, or 5 cubed, a mathematically significant number in a base 60 system. The angular relationship between the two sites, measured from the North Pole, is approximately 36 degrees, which is 1/10 of a full circle in Sumerian terms, a clean mathematical relationship that would not exist if the sites were positioned randomly. Scholars who have examined these correlations typically offer two explanations. Either the relationships are coincidental, the result of our pattern-seeking minds finding order in chaos, or the measurements are being selectively adjusted to produce the desired results, cherry-picking which distances and angles to emphasize, while ignoring those that do not fit. Both explanations are possible, but neither explains why the Sumerian texts themselves describe the gods establishing a measured network of sacred sites across the earth, a network that was planned before human civilization began and that humans inherited without fully understanding its purpose or extent. The curious precision of ancient surveying has troubled mainstream archaeology for decades, though the trouble is rarely discussed openly. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy of approximately 3 arc minutes, an error of less than 0.05 degrees. The base is level to within 2.1 centimetres across a distance of over 230 metres. The 4 sides are equal in length to within a tolerance that modern construction struggles to achieve. None of this should be possible with the technology that conventional archaeology attributes to Old Kingdom Egypt. Copper tools, wooden sledges, stone hammers, and human labour organised by bureaucratic efficiency but limited by the capabilities of the Bronze Age. The standard explanation is that the Egyptians achieved this precision through patient observation, through generations of trial and error, through techniques that have been lost, but that must have existed because the results are undeniable. But the Sumerian texts suggest another possibility. If the Emi of measurement, the Emi of the surveyor, the Emi of establishing boundaries were divine powers bestowed upon humanity by the Anunnaki, if these capabilities were inherited rather than invented, then the precision of ancient monuments is not evidence of lost human techniques. It is evidence of preserved divine technology, methods of measurement and construction that the gods established and that humans maintained as best they could, gradually losing capability over time as the original knowledge faded. The scholarly debate over these correlations has been effectively suppressed, not through conspiracy, but through the normal operation of academic incentives. Scholars who propose connections between Sumer and Egypt that fall outside the conventional framework risk marginalization. Grant funding disappears, publications become difficult, careers stall. It is much safer to treat each ancient civilization as an independent development, to assume that similarities are coincidental or the result of limited trade contacts, to maintain the comfortable narrative that human beings built these monuments through their own ingenuity without any inheritance from a previous age. But the Sumerian texts do not support this comfortable narrative. They describe the Anunnaki as measurers of heaven and earth, as establishers of boundaries, as beings who marked sacred sites across the world before humanity took its place in the cosmic order. The ziggurats were built as Dieu Anki, bonds between heaven and earth, at locations the gods had predetermined. The pyramids rise at the centre of the ancient world, aligned with a precision that implies knowledge beyond what conventional history admits. And the question that frames this chapter becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. If the Anunnaki measured and marked the earth, if they established a network of sacred sites according to a cosmic plan, if the Great Pyramids stand at the centre of that network, then what were they measuring? What were they marking? The obvious answer, the answer the texts seem to imply without quite stating directly, is that the sites were chosen for a purpose, that the markers served a function, that the Anunnaki were not merely decorating the planet but establishing infrastructure for some project that we can no longer fully comprehend. The Great Pyramids in this reading were not tombs, were not monuments to human vanity, were not even primarily religious structures. They were installations, components of a system that spanned continents, built at coordinates that had been calculated before the first pharaoh took his crown, maintained for millennia by civilizations that knew the structures were sacred, but could no longer remember why. What did the Anunnaki expect to find at these locations? What did they expect to store? The texts do not answer directly, but they preserve the memory of a time when the earth was measured, when the sacred sites were established, when the bonds between heaven and earth were fixed in stone with precision that we can admire but cannot easily explain. And if the pyramids were part of that original network, then whatever lies within them, whatever waits in the chambers that have never been opened, may not be the remains of Egyptian kings. It may be something far older, far stranger, and far more significant than any tomb. Chapter 3. The Duat Below and the Duat Beyond. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a journey, a passage through a realm they called the Duat, a place that existed simultaneously beneath the earth and beyond the stars, where the soul of the deceased would navigate through chambers and corridors, face trials and judgments, encounter guardians and gates, and ultimately achieve transformation or annihilation depending on how successfully they had prepared for the crossing. The Duat was mapped in extraordinary detail across the walls of royal tombs, in the texts inscribed inside pyramids, on the papyrus scrolls placed with mummies, and in the architectural structures built to facilitate the journey. Egyptologists have traditionally interpreted the Duat as purely symbolic, as a mythological landscape representing psychological or spiritual states, as the imagination of a death-obsessed culture projecting its fears and hopes onto an afterlife that existed only in belief. But the descriptions are strangely specific for mere symbolism. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, inscribed on the walls of pyramids beginning around 2400 BC, describe the Duat with architectural precision. Narrow passages that slope downward, chambers that open at specific intervals, gates guarded by beings who demand passwords, halls where divine councils sit in judgment, and a final chamber where transformation occurs. The texts provide measurements in some cases, orientations in others, and descriptions of what the soul will see at each stage of the journey. They read less like spiritual poetry and more like instructions, as if the scribes were describing a real place that initiates might actually visit. 4,000 kilometers to the east, in the clay tablet archives of ancient Sumer, another underworld waited to be described. The Sumerians called it the Kuar, the mountain land beneath the earth, or Kigal, the great below. In the mythology, the goddess Inanna descends to the Kuar to challenge her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, and the text describing her journey is among the oldest narrative poems in human history. But what makes the descent of Inanna remarkable is not its mythological content. It is the precision of its structure. Inanna passes through 7 gates, and at each gate she must surrender an article of her divine regalia: her crown, her measuring rod, her necklace, her breastplate, her ring, her rod of lapis lazuli, and finally her royal robe. By the time she reaches the throne room of Ereshkigal, she is naked and powerless, stripped of everything that marked her as a goddess. The 7 gates are not random. They correspond to specific architectural features, and the objects surrendered at each gate carry specific symbolic weight related to the powers associated with that level of descent. The structure is initiatory, designed to systematically remove the identity of the traveller until only the essential self remains to face judgment. The parallel to Egyptian duat texts is striking, not in surface detail but in deep structure. The Egyptian Book of the Dead describes the soul passing through gates, facing guardians who demand that specific words be spoken, surrendering attachments at each stage, until the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the Hall of Two Truths. Both traditions describe a journey downward, a series of trials, a progressive stripping away, and a final judgment before a divine tribunal. Both traditions treat the underworld as a real place with specific geography, and both traditions associate the underworld with physical structures on Earth, temples and tombs that served as interfaces between the world of the living and the realm below. The textual parallels become even more specific when you examine the architectural vocabulary. The Egyptian word for the judgment hall of Osiris is Ma'ati, the Hall of Two Truths, and it is described as a rectangular chamber with columns, where 42 assessors sit along the walls while the deceased stands before the throne of Osiris to account for their life. The Sumerian judgment hall in the Kur is called the Ekur-Ma, the exalted mountain house, and it is described as a place where the Anunnaki sit as judges, where the dead stand before Ereshkigal and her consort Nergal, where fates are determined and sentences pronounced. The architectural descriptions are remarkably similar. A hall of judgment, divine assessors arranged along the sides, a throne at the centre where the chief deity presides, and a process of accounting where the life of the deceased is weighed against cosmic standards. Scholars have typically explained these parallels through one of 2 mechanisms, either independent psychological development, the idea that all human cultures face death and naturally generate similar symbolic systems to cope with mortality, or cultural diffusion, the possibility that trading contacts between Mesopotamia and Egypt transmitted mythological concepts that were then adapted to local traditions. Both explanations are reasonable. Both are probably partially true, but neither explains the specificity of the architectural description, the precise number of gates in both traditions, the structural parallels that go beyond surface similarity to suggest a common source. The pyramid texts describe the internal structure of the afterlife journey in terms that correspond disturbingly well to the internal structure of the pyramids themselves. The descending passage, the ascending passage, the grand gallery, the chambers at different levels, the narrow shafts oriented to specific stars. These architectural features have traditionally been explained as practical elements of tomb construction, as passages for workers, as ventilation shafts, as structural necessities, but the pyramid texts describe them as stages of the journey through the duat. The descending passage leads to the realm below. The ascending passage leads toward the imperishable stars. The chambers are stations where transformation occurs. The shafts point toward Orion and the circumpolar stars, the celestial homes of Osiris and the eternal gods. The architecture and the texts match, not approximately but precisely, as if the pyramids were built to specifications derived from the mythology, or as if the mythology was describing specifications that already existed. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains chambers that have never been fully explained by conventional archaeology. The so-called Queen's Chamber and King's Chamber are positioned at specific heights within the structure, connected by passages of specific dimensions, oriented in specific directions. Neither chamber contained a sarcophagus when first entered in modern times. Neither showed evidence of actual burial. The King's Chamber contains an empty granite box, sometimes called a sarcophagus, but its dimensions do not match any known Egyptian coffin, and its placement in the chamber follows geometric relationships that suggest astronomical rather than funerary purpose. The shafts extending from both chambers point to the belt stars of Orion, from the King's Chamber and to Sirius from the Queen's Chamber, alignments that correspond exactly to the mythology. Orion is Osiris, the lord of the Duat, and Sirius is Isis, his consort. The pyramid was oriented to the gods of the underworld, designed so that shafts from its internal chambers would channel toward the celestial counterparts of the powers that ruled the realm below. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project, using muon tomography to peer inside the Great Pyramid without physical excavation, announced the discovery of a previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery. The void is at least 30 meters long, making it the most significant structural discovery inside the pyramid since the 19th century. The Egyptian authorities have been remarkably reluctant to investigate further. No plans have been announced to access the void. No drilling, no robotic exploration, no examination of what might lie within a space that has been sealed since the pyramid was constructed. The official explanation is that any investigation might damage the structure. Unofficially, one must wonder what they are afraid to find. The Sumerian descent texts describe the Kur as containing specific chambers with specific functions: the Chamber of Judgment, the Chamber of Decree, the Chamber of the Anunnaki Council, the chamber where the fates are recorded. These are not vague mythological concepts. They are described as actual locations within the underworld architecture, places where specific actions occur, where specific beings preside, where specific transformations take place. If the Duat and the QR are describing the same tradition, if both mythologies preserve memories of an actual place, if that place was physically instantiated in structures like the Great Pyramid, then the undiscovered chambers within the pyramid may not be empty voids or structural necessities. They may be the chambers described in texts 4,000 years old, the judgment halls and decree chambers and council rooms where the Anunnaki once held court. The orientation of the Great Pyramid to Orion has been studied extensively by researchers outside mainstream Egyptology, and their conclusions remain controversial but difficult to dismiss. The three pyramids of Giza correspond in their relative positions and sizes to the three stars of Orion's belt. The Nile corresponds to the Milky Way in this celestial mapping. The entire Giza complex appears to be a terrestrial mirror of a specific portion of the night sky as it appeared around 10 to 500 BC, a date that precedes dynastic Egypt by 7,000 years. Mainstream archaeology rejects this early dating, but the astronomical correlations are mathematically precise. Either the builders of the Giza complex were reproducing a sky pattern from thousands of years before their own time, or the complex is genuinely that old, or both possibilities suggest knowledge transmission across spans of time that conventional history does not acknowledge. And Orion in Egyptian cosmology is Osiris, the lord of the Duat, the ruler of the underworld, the god of the dead who nonetheless lives eternally in the sky. The pyramid that mirrors his celestial form is the structure that facilitates passage to his realm. The shafts that point to his stars are the channels through which the soul ascends or the god descends. The chambers within correspond to the chambers described in texts as the architecture of the afterlife. The Duat is not purely below and not purely beyond. It is both simultaneously underground and among the stars because the Great Pyramid was designed to connect those realms, to serve as the bond between heaven and earth, the interface between the world of the living and the kingdom of the dead. If this interpretation is correct, if the Duat texts and the Kur texts describe the same tradition, if both preserve memories of an actual architecture that exists within structures like the Great Pyramid, then the question that has haunted this inquiry from the beginning takes on new urgency. What is inside the chambers that have never been opened? What waits in the void above the Grand Gallery? What did the Anunnaki leave behind when they withdrew from active governance of the Earth? And did they leave it in the one structure built to survive any catastrophe, aligned to the stars of their celestial home? designed according to specifications that both Sumerians and Egyptians remembered as sacred without fully understanding why. The Great Pyramid stands in the desert, silent and patient, keeping secrets that the texts describe, but that modern archaeology has not yet been willing to pursue. The Duat is below and beyond, and the door between worlds may have been built in stone, waiting for someone to recognize what it was always meant to be. Chapter 4. What Enki knew about the Western lands. Among all the Anunnaki, one figure stands apart as the keeper of secrets, the master of hidden knowledge, the god who possessed understanding that even other gods did not share. His name was Enki, and the Sumerians revered him as the lord of the Abzu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, as the holder of the Me, the divine principles that govern civilization, as the architect of human destiny and the preserver of humanity during the Great Flood. Enki's attributes read like a curriculum vitae for a divine engineer. He invented writing, established the crafts, designed the first cities, created the systems of measurement and calculation that made civilization possible, and maintained archives of knowledge that stretched back to the beginning of time. His temple at Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition, was called the Abzu, the House of the Deep Waters, and it was said to contain libraries of tablets recording secrets that ordinary humans were not permitted to know. Enki was not merely a god of wisdom in the abstract sense. He was a technician, a designer, an architect of systems, both physical and cultural. The texts describe him laying out city plans, establishing irrigation networks, determining the courses of rivers, and fixing the positions of sacred sites according to cosmic calculations. When the other gods decided to destroy humanity with the flood, it was Enki who secretly preserved the knowledge necessary for survival, instructing Ziusudra to build the boat to gather the seeds and tablets to maintain the thread of civilization across the catastrophe. Enki was the god who remembered, the god who preserved, the god who ensured that what had been established would not be entirely lost. Now consider the Egyptian god Thoth. In the Egyptian pantheon, Thoth occupies a position remarkably similar to Enki's role among the Anunnaki. He is the god of wisdom, writing, measurement, and secret knowledge. He invented hieroglyphics, established the calendar, designed the systems of mathematics and geometry that made Egyptian civilization possible. He was called the Lord of Time, the Measurer, the Architect of Truth, the Keeper of the Divine Records. His cult center at Hermopolis was said to contain texts of such antiquity that even the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom regarded them as relics of a previous age. Thoth was depicted with the head of an ibis, the sacred bird associated with precision and calculation, and he was credited with recording the judgments of the dead in the Hall of Two Truths, maintaining the cosmic accounts that determined the fate of souls. The parallels between Enki and Thoth are not superficial. Both are gods of wisdom and secret knowledge. Both invented writing for their respective civilizations. Both established systems of measurement and calculation. Both are associated with water, Enki with the freshwater Abzu, and Thoth with the primordial waters of Nun from which creation emerged. Both preserved knowledge through catastrophe, Enki by instructing the flood hero and Thoth by recording divine wisdom in texts that would survive the ages. Both are credited with the design and placement of sacred structures. Both maintained archives of knowledge that ordinary humans could access only through initiation. The similarities are so precise that scholars who notice them typically explain them through cultural diffusion, suggesting that trading contacts between Mesopotamia and Egypt transmitted mythological concepts that were then adapted to local pantheons. But cultural diffusion does not explain why both figures are credited with the same specific technical accomplishments, why both are described as architects of civilization itself, why both possess knowledge that predates human memory. The Sumerian texts contain passages that have troubled translators for generations, passages where Enki is described as possessing knowledge of distant lands, territories beyond the borders of Mesopotamia, places where other sacred sites had been established according to the same cosmic plan. One fragmentary text from Nippur, catalogued as CBS 1673 and housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes Enki surveying the lands from his temple at Eridu, measuring distances to what the text calls the mountains of the west and the houses of the setting sun. The terminology is geographical rather than mythological. The text describes specific angular relationships, distances measured in Baru, orientations given in relation to stellar positions. Enki is not merely aware that distant lands exist, he possesses precise coordinates for structures that stand in those territories. Another text, preserved only in fragmentary Old Babylonian copies, describes Enki establishing communication with what it calls the Assembly of the Western Gods, a council that meets in a great house of stone beyond the Sea of Reeds. The Sea of Reeds is typically identified with the marshy regions of southern Mesopotamia, but the phrase could also describe the Red Sea, the body of water that would need to be crossed to reach Egypt from Mesopotamia. If the text is describing contact between Mesopotamian and Egyptian divine hierarchies, it would represent evidence of a coordinated pantheon that spanned both civilizations, a network of gods who communicated across distances and maintained a shared architectural tradition. The Egyptian tradition of Thoth designing the Great Pyramid according to a divine plan is preserved in texts that Egyptologists have typically dismissed as late theological elaboration, additions to the original mythology that reflect priestly speculation rather than genuine ancient tradition. But the core claim that Thoth possessed architectural knowledge that predated Egyptian civilization, and that he applied this knowledge to the design of sacred structures, appears in texts from multiple periods of Egyptian history. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu during the Ptolemaic period but claiming to copy much older documents, describe a group called the Sages of Mehit, who arrived in Egypt after a great disaster and established the sacred sites that would later become temple complexes. These sages are described as companions or followers of Thoth, beings who possessed knowledge of architecture, measurement, and cosmic alignment that they applied to the construction of structures throughout the Nile Valley. The text specifically mentioned that the sages worked according to plans that existed before the current age, blueprints preserved from a previous world that had been destroyed by water. The Annunaki. Stela, a controversial artifact discovered near the Great Sphinx in the 19th century, contains inscriptions that some scholars have dated to the Old Kingdom and others have dismissed as later fabrications. The stela describes the pharaoh Khufu not as the builder of the Great Pyramid, but as its restorer, stating that he found the structure in a damaged state and repaired it according to ancient specifications. If the stela is genuine, it suggests that Egyptian tradition preserved a memory of the pyramid existing before Khufu, designed and constructed by builders whose identity had been forgotten by the time of the Old Kingdom. If it is a later fabrication, we must ask why later Egyptians would invent a tradition that diminished the glory of their greatest pharaoh by attributing his monument to earlier unnamed architects. The architectural knowledge embedded in both ziggurats and pyramids follows mathematical principles that are difficult to explain as independent developments. Both building traditions employ precise astronomical alignments. Both incorporate the mathematical constants pi and phi into their proportions. Both use measurement systems based on the same underlying geometry, systems that divide the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the sphere of the Earth into units that correspond to observable astronomical cycles. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, based in mathematics, appears in Egyptian architecture in ways that are not adequately explained by coincidence or trade contact. The royal cubit, the fundamental unit of Egyptian measurement, contains subdivisions that relate to base-C calculations. The proportions of the Great Pyramid encode relationships that only make mathematical sense if the designers were working in a sexagesimal framework. Either the Egyptians independently developed mathematical systems identical to those of Sumer, or they inherited both systems from a common source that predated both civilizations. If Enki and Thoth represent cultural memory of the same original figure, or of the same knowledge tradition, then the implications extend far beyond comparative mythology. The architectural principles embedded in Sumerian and Egyptian monuments would derive from a single curriculum, a master plan that was distributed to multiple locations and implemented by builders who understood themselves as executing divine specifications rather than inventing original designs. The ziggurats and pyramids would be sister structures, built according to the same cosmic geometry, positioned according to the same astronomical calculations, serving the same fundamental purpose of connecting heaven and earth. The flood narratives of both traditions add another layer to this possibility. Both Sumer and Egypt preserve memories of a great deluge that destroyed an earlier civilization. Both describe knowledge being preserved through the catastrophe by divine intervention. Both credit their respective wisdom gods, Enki and Thoth, with ensuring that the essential principles of civilization survived the destruction. If the flood was a real event, if it genuinely destroyed a previous world, then the civilizations that emerged afterward would have been working from preserved records rather than developing culture from scratch. The sudden appearance of sophisticated writing, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture in both Mesopotamia and Egypt would not represent independent invention but recovery, the implementation of knowledge that had been carefully stored against exactly this contingency. The texts describe Enki as the god who warned Zeus Sudra, the flood hero, to gather not only animals and family but tablets, the recorded wisdom that would be needed to rebuild civilization after the waters receded. The texts describe Thoth as the recorder of divine knowledge, the keeper of archives that preserved everything from the pronunciation of sacred words to the specifications for constructing temples. Both figures are characterized primarily by their role as preservers, as maintainers of continuity, as the beings who ensured that the knowledge of one age would survive into the next. What did Enki know about the Western lands? The texts suggest he knew a great deal, that he possessed coordinates for distant structures, that he communicated with divine councils beyond Mesopotamia, that his knowledge extended to the full network of sacred sites that the Anunnaki had established across the earth. What did Thoth know about the specifications for the Great Pyramid? The texts suggest he knew everything, that he designed according to plans that predated Egypt itself, that his architectural wisdom came from a source older than human civilization, from an age before the flood, from the gods who had measured the earth and marked its sacred locations before humanity inherited the world. The possibility that emerges from this evidence is both simple and disturbing. Enki and Thoth may be different names for the same figure, or for the same office, or for the same tradition of knowledge preservation. The Sumerians and Egyptians may have been working from the same source material, implementing the same divine specifications, building according to blueprints that neither civilization had invented, but both had inherited. The Great Pyramid would then be not an Egyptian innovation, but a reconstruction, a physical instantiation of plans that existed before Egypt, plans that were held in the archives Enki maintained at Eridu, and the libraries Thoth kept at Hermopolis, plans that were distributed across the ancient world so that the network of sacred sites would survive any local catastrophe. The chapter closes with a question that refuses to resolve into comfortable certainty. If the architectural traditions of Sumer and Egypt derive from a common source, if Enki and Thoth represent the same knowledge tradition operating under different names, in different cultures, if the Great Pyramid was built according to specifications that predated both civilizations, then the comfortable narrative of independent human achievement begins to dissolve. We are left with the possibility that the greatest monuments of the ancient world were not invented but remembered, not created but recovered, not expressions of human genius, but implementations of a divine plan that was established before human history began, and that the wisest gods of each civilization were charged with preserving across the ages. Chapter 5. The Chamber of Records. In 1930, an American mystic named Edgar Cayce entered one of his famous trance states and described a vision that would capture the imagination of alternative history enthusiasts for generations. Cayce claimed that beneath the Great Sphinx of Giza lay a hidden chamber, a repository he called the Hall of Records, containing documents and artifacts from a lost civilization that had flourished before the biblical flood. According to Cayce, this chamber preserved the complete history and scientific knowledge of Atlantis, stored in a location that would remain sealed until humanity was ready to receive its contents. The prophecy was specific. The Hall of Records would be discovered before the end of the 20th century, and its opening would transform human understanding of the past. The 20th century ended without the chamber being found, and mainstream Egyptology has consistently dismissed the entire concept as New Age fantasy, the wishful thinking of people who want ancient mysteries to be more dramatic than the archaeological evidence supports. The dismissal is understandable. Cayce was not an archaeologist. His visions cannot be tested by scientific methodology. The idea of Atlantean records hidden beneath the Sphinx fits too neatly into Western romantic narratives about lost civilizations to be taken seriously as historical hypothesis. And yet, when you set aside Cayce and the popular culture mythology that has grown around his prophecies, when you return to the ancient texts themselves, you find something uncomfortable. The Sumerians described exactly what Cayce claimed to have seen: repositories of knowledge, deliberately constructed to survive catastrophe, hidden in sacred structures where they would wait for future generations to recover them. The Sumerian term for such repositories was Edub-Ba, literally the House of Tablets, and the texts describe these archives with the seriousness that ancient bureaucracies reserved for matters of genuine importance. The Edub-Ba at Nippur, the great scribal centre of ancient Sumer, was said to contain copies of every significant text in the Mesopotamian tradition: creation narratives, king lists, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, medical procedures, legal codes, and what the texts call the secrets of the gods. But the Nippur archive was not the only such repository. Other texts describe Edub-Bas established in locations specifically chosen for their durability, places where tablets could survive flood, fire, and the collapse of dynasties. One fragmentary text from the Old Babylonian period, preserved in the Yale Babylonian collection under catalogue number YBC 7289, contains what appears to be an administrative record listing multiple archive locations, including one described as the House of Tablets in the Western Mountain, a repository established by the Order of Enki to preserve the ME against the Day of Destruction. The phrase "the Day of Destruction" appears in multiple Sumerian texts as a reference to anticipated catastrophe, a time when the current order would be swept away, and only what had been properly preserved would survive to seed the next age. The Anunnaki, according to these texts, were not merely rulers, they were archivists, beings who understood that knowledge once lost might never be recovered, who took deliberate steps to ensure that the essential principle of civilization would endure beyond any single culture or era. The Atrahasis epic, which contains the Mesopotamian flood narrative, describes Enki instructing the flood hero not only to build a boat but to gather tablets to preserve written records that would be needed after the waters receded. The emphasis on documentation is striking. The gods were not merely saving biological life, they were saving information, the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that was about to be destroyed. If the Anunnaki established such archives in Mesopotamia, the question becomes unavoidable. Did they establish similar repositories elsewhere? The textual evidence suggesting Anunnaki involvement in Egyptian sacred sites, the parallels between Enki and Thoth as gods of wisdom and preservation, the shared architectural traditions that link ziggurats and pyramids, all point toward a coordinated network of sacred structures spanning multiple regions. And if that network existed, if the Anunnaki were as methodical as the texts suggest, then archives would have been established at every major node, repositories tailored to local conditions and designed to survive local catastrophes. The Great Pyramid of Giza, positioned at the geographical centre of the ancient world, aligned with astronomical precision, constructed from materials chosen for their durability, would have been the obvious location for the most important archive of all. The architectural features of the Great Pyramid have puzzled observers since antiquity, and the puzzlement has only deepened as our ability to examine the structure has improved. The pyramid contains multiple chambers at different levels, connected by passages of varying dimensions, oriented in specific directions. The so-called King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber are the most famous, but they are not the only internal spaces. The subterranean chamber, carved into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, remains unfinished according to conventional interpretation, its rough walls and irregular floor suggesting a project abandoned before completion. But why would the builders of the most precisely constructed monument in the ancient world leave a major chamber unfinished? Why expend the enormous effort required to excavate solid rock, only to abandon the space before it could serve any purpose? The alternative interpretation is that the subterranean chamber was deliberately left rough to disguise its true function, or that it serves as an access point to spaces that lie beyond it, spaces that have never been explored because official archaeology has never acknowledged their existence. The passages within the pyramid add to the mystery. The descending passage drops at a precise angle of 26 degrees 31 minutes, an angle that corresponds to the observation angle for the circumpolar stars from the latitude of Giza. The ascending passage rises at the same angle, creating a symmetry that suggests astronomical purpose rather than mere construction. Convenience. The Grand Gallery, that magnificent corbelled corridor leading to the King's Chamber, is unlike anything else in Egyptian architecture, its walls rising in 7 successive layers of precisely fitted stone, its dimensions exceeding what would be necessary for any practical purpose of tomb construction. The standard explanation is that these features facilitated the movement of workers and materials during construction, but the explanation fails to account for the precision of the angles, the astronomical correlations, or the sheer scale of the passages relative to the chambers they serve. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project announced results that should have made international headlines, but were instead greeted with cautious silence by the Egyptian archaeological establishment. Using muon tomography, a technique that employs cosmic ray particles to map density variations within large structures, the project detected a previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery. The void is substantial, at least 30 meters in length, making it comparable in size to the Grand Gallery itself. Its precise shape and contents remain unknown because no physical exploration has been conducted. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities acknowledged the discovery but expressed reluctance to investigate further, citing concerns about damage to the structure and the need for additional non-invasive scanning before any direct exploration could be considered. 7 years have passed since the announcement, and the void remains unexplored. The questions multiply when you consider what the void might represent. If it is merely a structural feature, a construction gap or relieving space designed to distribute the weight of the stones above, why was it not documented in the extensive literature on pyramid construction? Why does it not appear in any of the surveys conducted over the past 2 centuries? Why is it positioned where it is, above the most architecturally significant passage in the entire structure? If it is something else, if it is a chamber deliberately concealed, designed to remain hidden until technology advanced enough to detect it, then what might it contain? The Sumerian texts describe archives being placed in locations chosen for security and durability. The Great Pyramid is the most secure and durable structure in the ancient world. The logic suggests itself without needing to be forced. The architectural features of the pyramid as a whole suggest storage rather than burial, and this observation does not require alternative archaeology to recognize. The king's chamber contains an empty granite box, often called a sarcophagus, but its dimensions do not match any known Egyptian coffin, and no evidence of burial has ever been found within it. The lid that would have sealed it is absent. The chamber shows no traces of the funerary goods that invariably accompanied Egyptian royal burials, no canopic jars, no shabti figures, no traces of the elaborate preparation that marked even minor tombs of the period. When Caliph al-Ma'mun broke into the pyramid in 820 AD, hoping to find treasure, he found the chambers empty. Not looted empty, not stripped by tomb robbers who left behind the detritus of their work, but empty in a way that suggested nothing had ever been placed there, or that whatever had been placed there had been removed long before, carefully and completely, leaving no trace behind. The shafts extending from the chambers add another dimension to the storage hypothesis. These narrow channels, barely wide enough for a human arm, extend from the king's chamber and queen's chamber toward the outer faces of the pyramid, angled to point at specific stars. The northern shafts align with the circumpolar stars, the southern shafts with Orion and Sirius. For decades, these were dismissed as ventilation shafts, a practical feature to provide air circulation for workers in the deep interior. But ventilation shafts would not require astronomical precision. They would not need to point at specific stars, and they would not be blocked by stone doors, as robotic exploration in 1993 discovered. The southern shaft from the Queen's chamber ends in a small stone door with copper fittings, the only metal objects found within the pyramid structure. What lies beyond the door remains unknown, as subsequent robotic investigations found only another door, and another beyond that, each blocking further progress into spaces that may or may not exist beyond. The pattern of blocked passages, hidden chambers, and unexplored voids suggests a structure designed not for a single burial but for systematic containment of something that was meant to be retrieved under specific conditions. The Sumerian archives were designed to survive catastrophe and to be recovered when stability returned. The builders did not expect their records to remain sealed forever. They expected future generations, perhaps their own descendants, to locate the repositories and access their contents when the time was right. If the Great Pyramid was part of this network, if it was designed according to the same principles that governed the EWBA of Mesopotamia, then its sealed chambers and blocked passages would represent not permanent closure but temporary security, protection against the chaos of catastrophe with the expectation of eventual recovery. The question of what those chambers might contain cannot be answered without opening them, and the reluctance to do so speaks to anxieties that extend beyond structural concerns. If the Great Pyramid contains only empty spaces, only construction gaps, only the disappointing reality of stone and air, then opening the chambers would settle the matter definitively and silence the speculation that has surrounded the structure for millennia. But if the chambers contain something else, if they preserve records or artifacts that would challenge the conventional narrative of independent humans, development, if they hold evidence of the pre-flood civilization that both Sumerian and Egyptian texts describe, then opening them would require a fundamental reconsideration of human history. The institutional resistance to such reconsideration is powerful, not because of conspiracy, but because paradigm shifts are genuinely difficult for academic disciplines that have built their methodologies and reputations on the existing framework. The chapter does not claim that the Hall of Records exists. It does not claim that the Great Pyramid contains Atlantean documents or proof of ancient astronauts or any of the specific assertions that have accumulated around this mystery through decades of speculation. What the chapter claims is more modest and more unsettling. The Sumerian texts explicitly describe the Anunnaki establishing archives of knowledge in sacred structures chosen for their durability. The Great Pyramid is the most durable sacred structure in the ancient world, positioned at Ter, a location of geographical significance, aligned with astronomical precision, containing chambers and passages whose purposes remain unexplained despite 2 centuries of study. The textual tradition and the architectural evidence point in the same direction. If the Anunnaki building project extended to Egypt, as the evidence we have examined suggests, then the Great Pyramid would have been designed not to house the dead, but to preserve the knowledge of a dying age, sealed against catastrophe, waiting through millennia for the moment when someone would recognize what it was always meant to contain. Chapter 6. The Mathematics of Inheritance. Mathematics is the one language that cannot lie, the one form of knowledge that transcends cultural interpretation, the one domain where truth is absolute and verifiable across millennia. A triangle's angles sum to 180 degrees, whether you measure it in ancient Sumer or modern New York. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is pi, whether you calculate it with clay tablets or supercomputers. The relationship between the sides of a right triangle follows the same theorem whether you call it Pythagorean or acknowledge that the Babylonians knew it 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. When we find the same mathematical principles embedded in the monuments of civilizations that supposedly developed independently, we are not dealing with interpretation or symbolism or cultural diffusion of abstract ideas. We are dealing with evidence, hard and measurable, of shared knowledge that must have been transmitted somehow from a common source. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, mathematics based on the number 60 rather than the number 10, remains one of the great mysteries of ancient knowledge. We use base 10 because we have 10 fingers. It is the natural counting system for beings with our anatomy, and virtually every human culture has developed decimal mathematics through the simple expedient of looking at their hands, but the Sumerians used base 60, a system with no obvious anatomical basis, a system that requires memorizing 60 distinct numerical symbols rather than 10, a system that should have been far more difficult to develop and maintain than the decimal alternative. And yet base 60 proved so powerful, so useful, so precisely suited to astronomical calculation that we still use it today. There are 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour because the Sumerians chose base 60 more than 4,000 years ago. There are 360 degrees in a circle for the same reason. Our fundamental units for measuring time and angle derive from a mathematical choice that makes no intuitive sense unless you understand what base 60 can do that base 10 cannot. The number 60 is the smallest number divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It is also divisible by 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This property makes it extraordinarily useful for astronomical calculations, where you need to divide circles into segments, track cycles within cycles, and maintain precision across observations spanning generations. The Sumerians did not stumble onto base 60 through trial and error. The system appears in the earliest mathematical tablets fully formed, already sophisticated, already capable of expressing fractions, calculating areas, solving what we would now call algebraic equations. It appeared as if it had been taught, as if someone who already understood its power had transmitted it. It describes who then maintained it without fully grasping why it worked so well. The Great Pyramid of Giza encodes mathematical relationships that scholars have debated for centuries, and the debate continues because the evidence refuses to resolve into comfortable coincidence. The pyramid's base perimeter, measured in the Egyptian royal cubit of approximately 52.4 centimeters, is 1760 cubits. Its height, including the now missing capstone, was 280 cubits. The ratio of perimeter to height is 1760 divided by 280, which equals 62857, a number that matches the value of 2 times pi to 4 decimal places. This means that if you draw a circle with the pyramid's height as its radius, the circumference of that circle equals the perimeter of the pyramid's base. The relationship is too precise to be accidental. Either the builders intentionally encoded pi into the structure's dimensions, or they were following a design template that encoded pi without their conscious awareness, or the correspondence is a coincidence of such improbability that invoking it strains credulity beyond reasonable limits. The pyramid also encodes phi, the golden ratio of approximately 1.618, the number that governs spiral growth in nature, that appears in the proportions of the human body, that artists and architects have employed for millennia to create forms that the human eye finds instinctively pleasing. The ratio of the pyramid's slant height to half its base length approximates phi. The ratio of the total surface area to the base. Area approximates phi squared. These relationships emerge from the pyramid's specific angle of inclination, 51 degrees and 51 minutes, an angle that produces a pyramid whose proportions embody both pi and phi simultaneously. No other angle achieves this. The builders either knew exactly what they were doing, selecting dimensions that would encode these constants into their monument, or they were working from specifications that encoded these constants without explanation, following a template whose mathematical properties exceeded their understanding. The Pythagorean theorem appears in Babylonian clay tablets dating to at least 1800 BC, a full millennium before Pythagoras lived. Tablet YBC 7289, housed at Yale, contains a diagram of a square with its diagonals marked, and the diagonal length is calculated using the relationship between the sides of a right triangle that we express as a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The calculation is performed in sexagesimal notation with remarkable precision, accurate to 6 decimal places in modern terms. The Babylonians did not call it the Pythagorean theorem. They did not prove it in the Greek sense of formal geometric demonstration. They simply used it as a known tool, as inherited knowledge, as something that had been taught to them by previous generations who had learned it from generations before that, stretching back into a past they could not fully trace. The Great Pyramid demonstrates the same theorem in its internal geometry. The king's chamber is positioned at a height that forms a 3 of 4 5 right triangle with specific points on the pyramid structure. The passage angles relate to the chamber positions through ratios that embody Pythagorean relationships. The entire monument can be analysed as a 3-dimensional expression of geometric theorems that the Greeks would not formalize for another 2,000 years. The knowledge was there, it was applied, it was built into stone with precision that modern baids engineers admire but struggle to replicate. But where did it come from? The Egyptian royal cubit, the fundamental unit of measurement used throughout pharaonic architecture, contains subdivisions that reveal its connection to the sexagesimal system supposedly unique to Mesopotamia. The cubit was divided into 7 palms, and each palm into 4 fingers, giving 28 fingers per cubit. But the cubit was also divided into another system of 6 spans of 4 fingers each, giving 24 fingers per cubit measured differently. The existence of both systems, one based on 7 and one based on 6, suggests that the Egyptian measurement system incorporated elements from multiple sources, including a sexagesimal component that should not be present if Egyptian mathematics developed independently. When you analyse the Great Pyramid's dimensions in terms of their relationship to basicity units, patterns emerge that are difficult to attribute to coincidence. The base length of the pyramid is very close to 440 royal Sumerian cubits, and 440 is 3t plus 80, or 6 times Suli plus 80, or alternately 11 times 40, a number that resonates with sexagesimal subdivision. The height of 280 cubits is 4 times 70, or 7 times 40, or in sexagesimal terms a number that relates to the 7 base subdivision of the cubit itself. The perimeter of 1760 cubits is 440 times 4, which is 1760, a number that factors into 32 times 55, or 16 times 110, or 8 times 220, patterns that embed relationships between decimal and sexagesimal arithmetic. These correspondences could be coincidental, but they multiply as you examine the structure more closely, suggesting that the pyramid's designers were working within a mathematical framework that incorporated both Egyptian and Mesopotamian elements, or that both systems derived from a common ancestor that neither civilization remembered as distinct from their own tradition. The astronomical alignments of both Sumerian and Egyptian monuments share precision that the standard narrative of independent development cannot adequately explain. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an error of less than 0.05 degrees, an accuracy that exceeds what should be achievable without instrumentation that the builders supposedly did not possess. The temple platforms of Mesopotamia show similar precision in their cardinal orientations, aligned to the rising and setting points of specific stars, positioned to observe particular celestial events with exactitude that implies sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Both traditions tracked the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the vernal equinox to shift through the zodiac over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. The Sumerians encoded precession into their mythology, with the succession of zodiacal ages representing different epochs of cosmic history. The Egyptians aligned their monuments to stellar positions that corresponded to specific precessional epochs, including alignments that point to the configuration of the sky as it appeared around 10,500 BC, a date that precedes dynastic Egypt by more than 7 millennia. Either both civilizations independently discovered precession, one of the most subtle astronomical phenomena observable from Earth, requiring centuries of careful record-keeping to detect, or they inherited the knowledge from a source that had already accumulated those centuries of observation. The Orion correlation appears in both traditions with specificity that challenges the independent development hypothesis. The Egyptians identified Orion with Osiris, the god of the dead and lord of the Duat, and they aligned the shafts of the Great Pyramid to point toward Orion's belt as it appeared in the night sky of their era. The Sumerians associated the same constellation, which they called Siper-zi-anna, the true shepherd of heaven, with the god Dumuzi, a dying and rising deity whose mythology parallels that of Osiris in ways that comparative religion has long recognized but never adequately explained. Both cultures treated Orion as a figure of supreme importance, a celestial marker connected to death, resurrection, and the journey between worlds. Both built monuments oriented to this constellation. Both encoded its position into their sacred architecture with precision that required advanced astronomical observation. The same stars, the same mythology, the same architectural response, in civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers and supposedly developing without significant contact. The precision problem becomes acute when you attempt to explain how Bronze Age cultures achieved measurements that modern technology finds challenging to replicate. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across a distance of more than 230 meters. The four sides are equal in length to within a tolerance of less than 0.1%. The right angles at the corners are accurate to within a few arc seconds. The facing stones, now mostly removed, were cut and fitted with gaps of less than 0.5 millimeters, thinner than a sheet of paper. The standard explanation invokes patient observation, accumulated experience, trial and error over generations, the slow development of techniques through practice. But the Great Pyramid was supposedly the first structure of its kind at its scale. There was no prior monument on which to develop and refine the techniques. The pyramid of Khufu's father, Sneferu, at Dashur shows evidence of construction problems, angles changed midway through building, structural issues that required correction. Yet Khufu's pyramid, the next in the sequence, shows none of these problems. It is the most precisely built structure of the ancient world, with no evidence of the learning curve that should have preceded it. The mathematics suggests not development but implementation, not invention but inheritance, not the gradual accumulation of human knowledge, but the application of a pre-existing template by builders who understood the specifications well enough to execute them but may not have fully grasped the principles that generated them. The possibility that emerges from this examination is uncomfortable for conventional archaeology but difficult to dismiss on mathematical grounds alone. The shared mathematical language between Sumerian and Egyptian monuments, the sexagesimal elements embedded in Egyptian measurement, the encoding of pi and phi in structures that predate Greek mathematics by millennia, the astronomical alignments that require centuries of prior observation to achieve, the precision that exceeds what trial and error at this scale should produce, all point toward a common curriculum, a teaching tradition that distributed mathematical and astronomical knowledge to multiple locations, a source that predated both civilizations and that neither fully remembered as distinct from their own genius. The Anunnaki, if they existed as the Sumerian texts describe them, would have been the teachers. They are credited with bestowing the Emmy of measurement, the Emmy of the surveyor, the Emmy of astronomical observation, the fundamental principles that made precise architecture possible. They are described as measuring heaven and earth, as establishing the coordinates of sacred sites, as possessing knowledge that they transmitted to humanity during the age before the flood. If this transmission occurred, it would explain the mathematical fingerprint that appears in monuments separated by geography, but united by precision. The Great Pyramid would then be not merely a tomb, not merely a temple, not merely a monument to human ambition, but a textbook, the mathematical knowledge of a previous age written in stone for future generations to rediscover. The relationships between its dimensions encode the constants that govern the universe. Pi and phi and the Pythagorean relationships and the astronomical cycles that structure time itself. The builders may have understood what they were preserving, or they may have been following specifications whose full significance exceeded their comprehension. But the mathematics is there, carved in Tempton limestone, waiting for anyone with the knowledge to read it. Mathematics does not lie. It does not evolve independently to identical conclusions. It does not produce the same constants in the same structures by coincidence. When we find the same mathematical language in monuments built by civilizations that supposedly never met, we are finding evidence of connection, of transmission, of a shared inheritance that official history has not yet acknowledged. The Anunnaki may be mythology, may be memory, may be something in between, but the mathematics is fact, measurable and verifiable, and it tells a story that the conventional narrative cannot contain. Chapter 7. What survived the flood? The flood is not unique to the Bible, and this is perhaps the most unsettling fact that emerges from comparative study of ancient traditions. The Sumerians recorded the deluge in the Eridu Genesis and the Epic of Atrahasis, centuries before the Hebrew scriptures were composed. The Babylonians preserved it in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero superhero Utnapishtim tells his story to a king desperate for the secret of immortality. The Egyptians remembered a great inundation in the texts of the Edfu temple, describing an age when the primordial waters rose and destroyed the homeland of the Kandurs. The Greeks knew it as the flood of Deucalion. The Hindus preserved it in the Matsya Purana, where Manu is warned by a divine fish to build a boat. The Chinese recorded the Great Flood of Gunyu. The Maya described world ages ending in water. The Hopi remember waters covering the earth before the current world emerged. More than 500 distinct flood narratives have been documented across human cultures, spanning every inhabited continent, preserved in traditions that developed in isolation from one another, telling variations of the same essential story. The world was destroyed by water, a few survived through divine warning, and civilization had to be rebuilt from what those survivors preserved. The ubiquity of the flood narrative has been explained in various ways. Some scholars suggest it reflects universal human experience of local flooding, rivers overflowing, coastlines changing, the trauma of water destroying communities magnified through generations of retelling until local disasters became cosmic catastrophes. Others propose that the narratives preserve genuine memory of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, when glacial melt raised ocean levels by over 100 meters and drowned coastal settlements around the world. Still others argue for a specific catastrophic event, perhaps an asteroid impact or supervolcanic eruption that triggered rapid climate change and flooding on a scale that affected multiple continents simultaneously. The explanations differ, but they share a common assumption. The flood, whatever its cause, was a natural disaster, an act of nature or cosmic accident that humans survived through luck, divine favor, or both. But the Sumerian text suggests something different, something far more disturbing than natural catastrophe. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood is not a random disaster. It is a deliberate decision, a policy measure implemented by the Council of the Anunnaki after other attempts to control human population had failed. The gods created humanity to perform labor, but humanity multiplied beyond projections, becoming noisy, chaotic, and unmanageable. Plague was sent but failed. Drought was imposed but failed. Famine was engineered but failed. Each time the population recovered and expanded further. Finally, Enlil proposed the ultimate solution: complete annihilation through flood, a reset that would reduce humanity to zero and allow the gods to start over or to abandon the project entirely. The language of the text is administrative rather than mythological. The flood is described as a management decision, a calculated response to a system that had grown beyond the capacity of its administrators to control. The gods do not rage against human sin or moral failure. They complain about noise, about overpopulation, about the disruption of their rest. The tone is that of executives discussing a failed project, weighing costs and benefits, ultimately authorizing termination. Only Enki dissents, and his dissent takes the form of covert action rather than open opposition. He warns Atrahasis, instructs him to build a boat, tells him what to gather and preserve, and ensures that a remnant survives to carry forward the thread of civilization. The warning itself raises questions that the text does not directly address. If the flood was a divine decision, if the gods controlled its timing and extent, then they knew in advance exactly what would happen and when. Enki's warning was not a weather prediction. It was insider information, knowledge of a planned operation shared with a chosen human against the explicit wishes of the Divine Council. The preparation time given to Atrahasis suggests a project timeline. Gather materials, construct the vessel, load the cargo, seal the doors, wait for the waters. This is not the behavior of beings reacting to an unexpected natural disaster. This is the behavior of beings executing a scheduled event, with one member breaking ranks to preserve something the others had decided to destroy. The Egyptian tradition of Thoth preserving wisdom before catastrophe follows the same pattern. The Edfu building texts describe sages who arrived in Egypt after a great disaster, carrying with them the knowledge necessary to rebuild civilization. These sages are called the followers of Thoth, beings who possessed the specifications for sacred architecture, the principles of measurement and alignment, the secrets of the gods that would allow temples to be constructed according to divine patterns. The texts explicitly state that these sages worked to restore what had existed before, that they were not inventing but recovering, that their knowledge derived from an earlier age that had been destroyed by water. Thoth himself is credited with recording all essential wisdom before the disaster struck, with creating archives that would survive the inundation and be available to guide reconstruction afterward. The emphasis on pre-disaster preservation is striking. Both traditions describe beings who knew the catastrophe was coming, who took deliberate steps to ensure that specific knowledge would survive, and who made choices about what to save and what to allow to perish. The flood in these accounts is not primarily a story of destruction. It is a story of selection, of filtering, of deciding what from the previous age deserved to continue into the next. And the structures built to house this preserved knowledge would need to be designed for permanence, engineered to survive any disaster, positioned and constructed to endure when everything else was swept away. The geological debate over the age of the Sphinx has simmered at the edges of Egyptology for decades, occasionally flaring into controversy before being suppressed by mainstream dismissal. In 1991, geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University presented research at the Geological Society of America suggesting that the Sphinx showed evidence of water erosion, specifically the kind of erosion produced by prolonged rainfall rather than wind and sand. The vertical weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure, Schoch argued, were inconsistent with the arid conditions that have prevailed in Egypt since the end of the wet period around 5000 BC. If the erosion was caused by rainfall, and if significant rainfall had not occurred on the Giza plateau for 7,000 years, then the Sphinx must be older than Egyptology's conventional dating of approximately 2500 BC, much older, possibly dating to 10,000 BC or earlier, to a time when Egypt received sufficient rainfall to produce the erosion patterns visible on the monument. The implications of this dating are profound enough that most Egyptologists have simply refused to engage with the evidence. If the Sphinx is 7,000 years older than the pyramids, then it was built by a civilization that predates dynastic Egypt by millennia, a civilization whose existence is not acknowledged in the conventional archaeological record. If that civilization existed, if it possessed the capability to carve the Sphinx from bedrock and the knowledge to align it with astronomical precision, then everything we think we know about the development of human civilization requires revision. The water erosion hypothesis remains controversial, vigorously disputed by Egyptologists who point to alternative explanations for the weathering patterns. But the hypothesis has not been disproven, and the geological evidence continues to trouble researchers who approach it without pre-commitment to the conventional timeline. And if the Sphinx is genuinely pre-flood, if it was carved before the catastrophe that the Sumerian texts describe, then the question of the pyramid's age must also be revisited. The Great Pyramid's design features suggest construction for permanence on a scale that exceeds any practical purpose of tomb building. The core structure consists of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each, with some blocks in the king's chamber weighing up to 80 tons. The limestone was quarried locally, but the granite for the internal chambers was transported from Aswan, nearly 1,000 kilometers away. The precision of the construction has already been discussed, but the durability deserves separate consideration. The pyramid has survived nearly 5,000 years of earthquakes, erosion, vandalism, and the removal of most of its original casing stones. It remains, standing largely intact, outlasting every other structure built in the ancient world. The Roman Colosseum is a ruin. The Greek temples are fragments. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia are eroded mounds. But the Great Pyramid endures, diminished but unbroken, precisely because it was built to endure. The pyramidal form itself offers maximum stability. The structure cannot topple because its centre of gravity is low and its base is broad. It resists earthquake damage because the stress of seismic waves is distributed across the entire mass rather than concentrated at weak points. It resists erosion because the angle of the sides sheds water rather than allowing it to pool. It resists decay because stone does not rot, does not burn, does not require maintenance to maintain structural integrity. If you wanted to build something that would survive any conceivable catastrophe, if you wanted to create a structure that would still be standing after flood, after earthquake, after fire, after millennia of neglect, you would build a pyramid. The pyramidal form appears in flood traditions across cultures with a consistency that suggests more than coincidental choice. The Mesopotamian ziggurats are stepped pyramids, and the Sumerian texts describe humanity ascending ziggurats to survive the rising waters. The Mesoamerican pyramids, built by cultures whose flood narratives describe previous world ages ending in water, served as platforms above the flooding that regularly affected their lowland cities. The Hindu traditions describe the gods and demons together, creating Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the centre of the world, as a refuge and anchor during the churning of the cosmic ocean. The mountain as refuge. The pyramid as artificial mountain, the elevated platform as survival architecture. The pattern repeats across traditions that developed in geographical isolation, as though the memory of seeking high ground during the deluge was encoded into the sacred architecture of every subsequent civilization. If the Anunnaki knew the flood was coming, if they had decided upon it as a council, or at least knew the decision had been made, then their building projects before the catastrophe would have been designed with survival in mind. The tablets describing the Am'i, the fundamental principles of civilization, consistently emphasize that these principles needed to be preserved, that they existed before the flood and needed to be transmitted to the age that would follow. Enki's instruction to Atrahasis to gather not only family and animals but tablets and seeds suggests a systematic preservation effort, a deliberate choice about what knowledge was essential and what could be allowed to perish. The temples and ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids and temples of Egypt, the megalithic sites scattered across the ancient world would then be understood not as monuments to human achievement but as survival caches, repositories designed to protect their contents through the catastrophe that the builders knew was coming. The question of what they were preserving leads necessarily to the question of what they feared losing. The Am'i encompassed everything that made civilization possible: kingship, priesthood, writing, measurement, agriculture, metallurgy, law, medicine, astronomy. These are not abstract concepts, but practical technologies, accumulated knowledge that requires continuous transmission to survive. If a catastrophe destroyed the teachers, if it killed the scribes and priests who maintained the oral and written traditions, the knowledge would be lost, even if individual humans survived. You cannot reinvent writing by surviving a flood. You cannot rediscover metallurgy by rebuilding after a catastrophe. You cannot recover astronomical observations that required centuries to accumulate. The knowledge survives only if it is deliberately preserved, stored in forms that can survive destruction and be accessed by survivors who may not initially understand what they have found. The Great Pyramid in this reading would be the ultimate knowledge vault, positioned at the geographical centre of the ancient world, aligned with astronomical precision that encodes mathematical constants into its dimensions, constructed from materials that can survive any disaster short of the complete destruction of the planet, designed with internal chambers whose purpose may not be burial at all but storage. The hidden voids detected by modern scanning, the blocked passages that lead to undiscovered spaces, the careful sealing of the entire structure against entry. These features make sense if the purpose was preservation rather than commemoration. The builders were not trying to honour a dead king, they were trying to ensure that something would survive the end of a world. The uncomfortable question that emerges from this analysis concerns the nature of the catastrophe itself. If the Sumerian texts are correct that the flood was a deliberate decision, a policy measure implemented by the Anunnaki to solve the problem of uncontrolled human expansion, then the catastrophe was not natural at all. It was manufactured, engineered, controlled by beings who possessed the capability to destroy the world and chose to exercise that capability for administrative reasons. The modern mind resists this interpretation because it implies technological capacity beyond what we believe was possible in antiquity, because it suggests that human survival was not guaranteed by divine love but permitted despite divine intent to destroy, because it raises questions about what other catastrophes in human history might have been deliberate rather than accidental. But the texts are explicit. The flood was decided in council. The timing was known in advance. Preparations could be made by those with access to inside information. And after the waters receded, the world was different. Human lifespans shortened, divine presence diminished, the age of direct governance ended, and the age of human autonomy began. Whatever the Anunnaki intended to destroy, something survived. Whatever they intended to end, something continued. The Great Pyramid stands in the desert as evidence of that survival, a monument to knowledge that outlasted the catastrophe, a vault whose contents we have not yet fully explored. If the builders knew the flood was coming, if they constructed the pyramid specifically to survive it, then what they placed inside would represent their judgment about what was most worth preserving, the essence of a civilization about to end, the inheritance they intended to pass to whatever world emerged from the waters. The pyramid would not be a tomb but a time capsule, not a monument to death but a message to the future, not the vanity of kings but the foresight of beings who understood that what they had built could be lost forever if they did not take deliberate steps to preserve it. The flood came and went. The waters rose and receded. Cities were destroyed and civilizations ended. But the pyramid remained, exactly as it was designed to remain, waiting through millennia for someone to recognize what it preserved and why. The Anunnaki, if they existed, made their choices about what to save. The Great Pyramid may contain the record of those choices, the archive of what they considered essential, the knowledge they believed was worth surviving the end of a world, and we have not yet looked inside all its chamber to discover what they left for us to find. Chapter 8. The Return That Never Came. The question that has hovered at the edges of this narrative, the question that any honest examination of the evidence must eventually confront, is devastatingly simple. If the Anunnaki built or commissioned these structures, if they possessed the knowledge and technology to create monuments that have endured for millennia, if they governed humanity directly during an age before the flood, then where are they now? The ziggurats still rise from the plains of Iraq, eroded but recognizable. The pyramids still stand on the Giza plateau, diminished but unbroken. The temples still align with stars whose positions have shifted over thousands of years. The structures remain, but the builders are absent. The cities they founded became ruins. The languages they taught fell silent. The rituals established in their honor continued for millennia, performed by priests who no longer understood their original purpose, until those rituals too faded into memory, and the memory faded into myth. If the Anunnaki were real, if they once walked among humans and governed human affairs, their disappearance is as significant as their presence, and the texts offer clues about what happened that deserve serious consideration. The Sumerian king list marks the transition with bureaucratic precision. Before the flood, 8 kings ruled for combined spans of over 241,000 years. Their reigns measured in units that suggest non-human lifespans or symbolic durations we can no longer fully decode. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven a second time, but now to human rulers whose reigns were measured in decades, then years, then the ordinary spans that characterize mortal life. The pattern is unmistakable. A gradual reduction, a progressive diminishment, a transition from one type of governance to another, but the texts do not describe the Anunnaki being destroyed. They do not record battles, defeats, or extinctions. Instead, they describe withdrawal, recession, a stepping back from direct involvement in human affairs. The gods become distant. Their presence becomes occasional rather than constant. Their commands come through dreams and omens rather than direct speech. They ascend to their celestial domains and do not return. The Egyptian tradition preserves the same pattern with different vocabulary. The Neteru, the Egyptian term often translated as gods but carrying implications of divine power rather than mere divinity, are described in the earliest text as having ruled Egypt directly during an age called Zep Tepi the first time. The Turin King List, that damaged papyrus that so frustrated Champollion's attempts to establish Egyptian chronology, records reigns of the Neteru spanning thousands of years, followed by reigns of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, demigods or divine servants who maintained connection between the Neteru and humanity. Only after these semi-divine intermediaries does the list transition to human pharaohs, the rulers whose tombs and monuments we can verify through archaeology. The structure mirrors the Sumerian pattern precisely: divine rulers, then intermediaries, then humans governing alone, and the transition is described not as conquest or catastrophe but as departure. The Neteru ascended. They returned to the sky, to the stars, to the realm from which they had originally descended. They left behind temples and rituals, instructions, and expectations, but they did not remain to ensure their commands were followed. They trusted, or perhaps they simply chose, to let humanity manage its own affairs within the framework they had established. The transformation of presence into ritual is one of the most poignant aspects of ancient religious history, and it occurs across every tradition that describes a previous age of divine governance. When the gods walked among humans, their wishes were known directly. Their instructions could be questioned, clarified, updated as circumstances changed. But when the gods departed, their instructions became fixed, preserved in texts and traditions that could not be updated, interpreted by priests whose authority derived from maintaining continuity rather than innovating change. Rituals that once facilitated direct communication became performances, repeated because they had always been performed, their original purpose forgotten, or transformed into theological abstraction. The temple became a museum of divine presence, maintaining the forms after the reality had departed. The offerings were still placed on altars, but the gods no longer consumed them. The prayers were still spoken, but the gods no longer answered. The festivals were still celebrated, but the presence being celebrated was memory rather than reality. This transformation explains one of the great puzzles of ancient religious practice. Why did humans continue performing rituals that manifestly did not work? Why did they continue offering sacrifices to gods who never appeared to receive them? Why did they maintain temples and priesthoods for millennia despite the absence of any verifiable divine response? The answer, if we accept the framework the texts suggest, is that the rituals were originally designed for beings who were present, who did respond, who did interact with their human servants. When those beings departed, the humans who remained did not know how to adapt. They did not understand why. The gods had left. They did not know whether the departure was temporary or permanent. They continued the rituals because the rituals were what they knew, because their entire social structure was organized around maintaining divine favor, because stopping the rituals would mean acknowledging that the gods were truly gone and might never return. The cargo cult phenomenon, documented by anthropologists in the 20th century, provides a contemporary parallel that illuminates this ancient pattern. During World War II, indigenous peoples of the South Pacific encountered advanced technology for the first time when Allied and Japanese forces established bases on their islands. Cargo planes brought supplies that seemed miraculous: manufactured goods, processed foods, machinery beyond anything the islanders had imagined possible. When the war ended and the bases closed, some islanders constructed replica control towers and runways from bamboo and palm fronds, performed rituals mimicking the behavior they had observed, and waited for the planes to return. The cargo cults were not irrational. They were attempts to recreate the conditions that had previously produced miraculous abundance. Attempts by people who did not understand the underlying technology to maintain practices that had once been associated with desired outcomes. The parallel to ancient temple practice is uncomfortable but illuminating. If the Anunnaki or Neteru possessed technology that seemed divine to humans, if they provided knowledge and resources that humans could not produce independently, If their presence guaranteed abundance and order, then their departure would have triggered exactly the response the cargo cults demonstrate: maintenance of forms without understanding, ritual repetition in hopes of restoring conditions that the practitioners did not fully comprehend. The humans who maintained the ziggurats and temples after the gods departed were performing their own version of cargo cult practice, preserving the behaviours associated with divine presence in hopes that divine presence would return. The pyramid building tradition in Egypt provides what may be the most compelling evidence for this interpretation. The Great Pyramid of Giza represents the apex of Egyptian architectural achievement, the most precisely constructed monument of the ancient world. But the pyramids built after Giza show a progressive decline in quality that is difficult to explain if the same tradition was being continuously transmitted. The pyramids of Khafra and Menkaure, Khufu's immediate successors, are smaller and less precisely constructed than the Great Pyramid. The pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties are significantly smaller still, built with rubble cores rather than solid stone, their surfaces crumbling while the Great Pyramid remained largely intact. By the Middle Kingdom, pyramid construction had essentially ceased, replaced by rock-cut tombs that required less specialised knowledge. The standard explanation is that the Old Kingdom exhausted its resources on pyramid construction, that the labour and materials required were unsustainable, that subsequent dynasties chose different forms of monumental expression. But this explanation does not account for the specific nature of the decline. The issue is not just that later pyramids are smaller, they are less well made. The precision that characterises the Great Pyramid is absent from its successors. The mathematical relationships embedded in its dimensions do not appear in later structures. The astronomical alignments become less exact. It is as though the knowledge required to build the Great Pyramid was not being transmitted, as though each subsequent generation knew a little less than the one before, as though a teaching tradition was fading rather than being maintained. If the original builders of the Great Pyramid were not human, or if they worked according to specifications provided by non-human sources, then the decline of pyramid quality would reflect not economic choice but knowledge loss. The humans who maintained the tradition after the original teachers departed could copy what they had seen, could approximate the techniques they had been taught, but they could not innovate or improve because they did not fully understand the principles underlying their practice. Each generation passed on slightly degraded knowledge, and over centuries the degradation accumulated until pyramid construction was no longer sustainable at any meaningful scale. The texts suggest that instructions were left, that the departing gods did not simply abandon humanity, but provided guidelines for continued operation, specifications to be followed, rituals to be maintained. The Emi that Enki preserved through the flood was supposed to be the foundation of civilized life in the post-flood age. The wisdom that Thoth recorded was supposed to guide Egyptian civilization through the millennia of divine absence. But instructions can be misinterpreted, records can be damaged, meanings can shift over generations of copying and recopying. The telephone game of textual transmission inevitably introduces errors, and those errors compound as centuries pass. By the time we encounter the ancient texts in their preserved forms, they are already copies of copies, edited and elaborated by generations of scribes who may not have understood what they were transcribing. The original instructions, if they existed, have been overlaid with interpretation and embellishment until separating the authentic from the added has become nearly impossible. The promised return appears in both Sumerian and Egyptian traditions, though never with the specificity that would allow verification. The Sumerians expected the gods to resume active governance at some future time, and their rituals were designed in part to maintain the conditions necessary for that resumption. The Egyptians anticipated a time when the Neteru would once again walk among humans, when Osiris would return from the Duat, when the first time would be restored and the current age of diminishment would end. Similar expectations appear in traditions worldwide: the return of Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, the future incarnation of Vishnu in Hindu eschatology, the messianic expectations of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Humanity has been waiting for the teachers to return, maintaining the structures and rituals they left behind, preserving whatever fragments of their knowledge, survived the centuries, hoping that the departure was temporary and that the age of divine guidance would resume. But the return never came. Millennia passed, empires rose and fell, the ziggurats crumbled. The pyramid casing stones were stripped for building materials. The temples were buried under sand and forgotten. The languages that once preserved divine instruction became dead scripts requiring scholarly reconstruction to decipher. and still the gods did not return. The waiting became its own tradition, the expectation of return transformed into religious hope, the specific anticipation of divine teachers replaced by abstract faith in cosmic justice. We stopped waiting for the Anunnaki and started waiting for salvation, for enlightenment, for some undefined transformation that would restore the wholeness we had lost without consciously remembering what we had lost or why. The structures they left behind stand as reminders of an age we cannot fully recover. The Great Pyramid still encodes mathematical constants we did not rediscover until modern times. The astronomical alignments still point to stellar positions that were significant in the Builders' era. The underground chambers still contain whatever was placed in them before the builders departed. But we approach these monuments as tourists and scholars, measuring and photographing, theorizing and debating, without the context that would allow us to understand what they meant to those who made them. We have inherited the physical structures but lost the instruction manual. We maintain the forms without understanding the functions. We are the cargo cult, building replica temples and performing replica rituals, waiting for gods who have not answered our prayers for 4,000 years. The question of why the return never occurred admits no definitive answer. Perhaps the Anunnaki were destroyed by some catastrophe of their own, their civilization falling as ours might fall, their return prevented by extinction rather than choice. Perhaps they continue to observe from whatever realm they retreated to, watching humanity struggle with the fragments of knowledge they provided, waiting for some threshold to be crossed before resuming contact. Perhaps they lost interest, their experiment with humanity judged a failure. Their attention turned to other projects in other places that we cannot imagine. Perhaps the entire framework is wrong, and the departure we have been, tracing through the texts, is metaphor rather than history, symbol rather than memory, meaning something other than literal divine withdrawal. But the texts remain, and the structures remain, and the pattern of decline and loss that characterizes ancient civilization after its initial flowering remains. Something happened that ended Dirac divine governance. Something removed the teachers from the classroom. Something left humanity alone with instructions we could barely read and structures we could not replicate. The flood may have been the mechanism, but the withdrawal preceded the flood in the texts, the decision to end the project, to let humanity fend for itself, to step back and observe rather than continue to manage. The flood was the reset, but the decision to withdraw was made before the reset was implemented. And afterward, in the age that followed, the gods became memory, became tradition, became mythology. They were still honoured. Their names were still invoked. Their images still decorated temples and appeared in texts. But they did not answer, they did not return. They did not explain why they had left or when they might come back. They simply departed, leaving behind structures that would outlast every subsequent civilization, leaving behind texts that would be copied and recopied until the copies were all that remained, leaving behind a species that would spend millennia trying to understand what had happened and why. The Great Pyramid stands in the desert as the most visible monument to this departure. It was built, if our analysis is correct, to preserve something through catastrophe, to maintain knowledge that the builders considered essential, to serve as a vault that would survive any disaster. It has survived. It still contains whatever was placed within it, but the builders who placed it there, who knew what it meant and why it mattered, have not returned to explain. We are left to excavate and speculate, to measure and theorize, to approach with our instruments and our hypotheses, a structure that was built for purposes we can only guess. The return that was promised never came. The silence has lasted 4,000 years, and the pyramid keeps its secrets, waiting for someone who may never arrive, preserving knowledge that we may never fully recover, standing as evidence of a presence that departed and left humanity to find its own way in a world we did not design and do not entirely understand. Chapter 9. What the Silence Preserved. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands today as it has stood for nearly 5,000 years, diminished by time and human scavenging, but fundamentally intact. Its core structure as solid as when the last stone was placed, its internal passages still navigable, its hidden spaces still unexplored. Tourists climb its exterior stones and pose for photographs. Scholars measure its dimensions with laser precision and debate its purpose in academic journals. Conspiracy theorists spin elaborate narratives about its origins and meanings, but the pyramid itself remains silent, keeping whatever secrets it was designed to keep, waiting with the patience of stone for someone to ask the right questions and possess the means to answer them. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project announced the discovery of a previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery, a space at least 30 meters long that had never been documented, never been entered, never been examined by any human eye since the pyramid was sealed. The discovery was made using muon tomography, a technique that measures the density variations within large structures by tracking particles from cosmic rays. The muons pass through solid stone more slowly than through empty space, allowing scientists to map the interior of the pyramid without drilling, without excavation, without physical intrusion of any kind. The technique revealed what centuries of exploration had missed: a significant chamber, comparable in size to the Grand Gallery itself, hidden in the heart of the monument. The announcement should have been a turning point in Egyptology. A new chamber in the Great Pyramid, the most studied ancient structure on Earth, discovered through technology unavailable to previous generations of researchers. The possibilities for new understanding seemed enormous, but the response from the Egyptian authorities was cautious to the point of suppression. The Ministry of Antiquities acknowledged the discovery but emphasized that further investigation would need to proceed slowly, that the nature of the void was unclear, that it might be merely a construction gap rather than a functional chamber, that any physical exploration would need to wait for additional non-invasive scanning that might take years to complete. 7 years have passed since the announcement. The void remains unexplored. No drilling has been approved. No robotic cameras have been inserted. No attempt has been made to determine what, if anything, the space contains. The official position is that caution is warranted, that the pyramid's integrity must be protected, that rushing to investigate could cause damage that cannot be undone. These concerns are not unreasonable. The Great Pyramid is irreplaceable, and any intervention carries risk. But the reluctance extends beyond reasonable caution into something that resembles avoidance. When researchers have proposed minimally invasive techniques that would cause no more damage than the drilling already conducted in previous decades of pyramid research, their proposals have been declined or indefinitely delayed. When questions are raised about the timeline for investigation, the answers are vague and non-committal. The pyramid keeps its secrets because we have chosen not to pursue them, and one must ask why. The Sumerian texts describe knowledge being preserved against future catastrophe, archives established in sacred structures where they would survive flood and fire and the collapse of civilizations. Enki instructed the flood hero to gather tablets as well as animals, to preserve the written record of everything that mattered, to ensure that the wisdom of the pre-flood age would be available to guide reconstruction after the waters receded. The ME, those fundamental principles of civilization, were not merely concepts but in actual objects in the Sumerian understanding, things that could be possessed and transferred and stored. If the Anunnaki building project extended to Egypt, if the Great Pyramid was part of the network of sacred sites they have established, if the same preservation logic that governed Mesopotamian archives applied to Egyptian monuments, then the hidden chambers of the pyramid would be the most significant repositories of all. They would contain whatever the builders considered most essential, the core knowledge that needed to survive any disaster, the inheritance they intended to pass to future ages. What modern technology might reveal in those chambers is a question that apparently troubles the institutions responsible for Egyptian antiquities. The conventional narrative of ancient history is deeply invested in the idea of independent human achievement, the story of our species rising from primitive beginnings, through our own ingenuity and effort to create the civilizations whose ruins we study. This narrative is not merely academic. It shapes our understanding of human potential, our sense of identity as a species, our relationship to the achievements of our ancestors. If the Great Pyramid was built by humans working alone, it represents the heights to which human capability can rise. But if the pyramid was built according to the specifications inherited from non-human sources, if its chambers contain records of an age before human history, if the knowledge embedded in its structure came from teachers who are not human, then the narrative requires fundamental revision. We would not be the authors of our own civilization. We would be the heirs, the students, the recipients of knowledge we did not generate and may not fully understand. The institutional reluctance to explore the hidden chambers of the pyramid may reflect not conspiracy but anxiety, the deep unease that would accompany any discovery that challenged the foundational assumptions of multiple academic disciplines. Egyptology, archaeology, ancient history, the history of science and mathematics, all of these fields rest on the assumption that human civilization developed through human effort, that the knowledge embedded in ancient monuments represents human discovery rather than inheritance from external sources. A discovery that contradicted this assumption would not merely require revising textbooks, it would require rethinking the entire enterprise of studying the human past, acknowledging that the story we have been telling ourselves may be not wrong in its details, but wrong in its fundamental premise. The three interpretations that have structured this narrative which offer different explanations for the patterns we have examined. The first interpretation, coincidence, holds that the parallels between Sumerian and Egyptian traditions are superficial, that the mathematical precision of the pyramids represents independent human achievement, that the flood narratives are mythological responses to local disasters magnified through oral tradition, that there is no hidden knowledge waiting to be discovered, because there was no external source from which such knowledge could have derived. This interpretation is intellectually economical. It requires no extraordinary assumptions, no revision of established frameworks, no acknowledgement of sources outside the conventional archaeological record. Its weakness is that it requires dismissing an enormous body of evidence as coincidental, treating precise mathematical relationships as accidents, ignoring textual traditions that explicitly describe the patterns we observe. The second interpretation, cultural connection, holds that the parallels reflect trade contacts, migration, and cultural diffusion that we have not fully documented, that knowledge was shared between Mesopotamia and Egypt through channels that left little archaeological trace, that the similarities represent human exchange rather than common inheritance from non-human sources. This interpretation acknowledges the patterns while preserving the essential narrative of human agency. Its weakness is that it struggles to explain the antiquity of the shared elements, the precision of the mathematical and astronomical knowledge, and the explicit textual claims that the knowledge originated before human civilization rather than developing through it. The third interpretation, common origin, holds that both Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations inherited their foundational knowledge from a source that predated both, that the Anunnaki and Neteru were memories of the same, teachers operating in different regions, that the structures and texts we study preserve fragments of a previous age that was destroyed by the catastrophe both traditions remember. This interpretation takes the ancient texts at something close to face value, acknowledging that the people who wrote them may have been describing their actual beliefs about their own history, rather than constructing elaborate mythologies for purposes we can only guess. Its weakness is that it requires accepting possibilities that our current scientific framework cannot accommodate, that it opens doors we may prefer to keep closed, that it suggests we are not the authors of our own story but characters in someone else's narrative. The question of which interpretation is correct cannot be answered definitively with the evidence currently available, and this uncertainty is itself significant. We live in an age of unprecedented technological capability. We can sequence genomes and split atoms and photograph black holes at the edge of the observable universe. We have sent robots to Mars and probes beyond the solar system. We possess tools of investigation that would have seemed godlike to the ancients whose monuments we study. And yet we cannot answer basic questions about the most famous structure on Earth. We cannot say with certainty who built the Great Pyramid, or how, or why. We cannot explain the mathematical precision embedded in its dimensions. We cannot account for the astronomical knowledge its alignments encode. We cannot explore its hidden chambers because we have not chosen to explore them, and we have not chosen to explore them perhaps because we are not certain we want to know what they contain. The question matters beyond academic curiosity because it touches the deepest issues of human identity and purpose. If we are the authors of our own civilization, if we rose from primitive beginnings through our own effort and ingenuity, if the pyramids and ziggurats and temples represent the heights of human achievement reached without external assistance, then we are genuinely remarkable. We have accomplished something extraordinary against long odds, building civilization from nothing through the accumulated effort of countless generations. We can take pride in what our ancestors achieved and confidence in our capacity to achieve still more in the future we are building. But if we are the heirs of a previous age, if our civilization is a reconstruction rather than an original creation, if the knowledge embedded in our oldest monuments was given rather than discovered, then our situation is more complicated. We are not entirely the authors of our story. We are continuing a project that began before us, working with tools and knowledge that were provided rather than invented, inheriting both the achievements and the limitations of a previous attempt at civilization that ended in catastrophe. This framing does not diminish human achievement, but it contextualizes it differently. We become not the pioneers but the settlers, not the inventors but the maintainers, not the creators but the inheritors of something we did not fully understand when we received it, and may not fully understand still. The final meditation that this narrative requires is the most personal and the most uncomfortable. What would change if we found what the Anunnaki left behind? What would happen if the hidden chambers of the Great Pyramid contained not empty space but actual records, actual artifacts, actual evidence of the pre-flood civilization that the texts describe? The practical implications would be enormous. Technologies that took millennia to redevelop might be recovered in their original forms. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge that we have only partially reconstructed might be completed. The history of human civilization would require complete revision, every textbook rewritten, every assumption questioned, every academic career built on the conventional narrative suddenly undermined. Religious traditions that claim divine origins for their teachings would need to confront the possibility that their gods had names the traditions did not remember, that the revelations they venerate were fragments of a larger knowledge system that was distributed across multiple cultures and continents. The psychological implications might be even more profound. We would need to accept that we are not alone in the universe in a way that differs from the usual UFO speculation. Not that aliens are visiting us now, but that non-human intelligences shaped our earliest development, that our foundational achievements were gifts rather than discoveries, that we have been orphans longer than we knew, children whose parents departed before we were old enough to remember them clearly. We would need to acknowledge that the teachers went silent for reasons we do not understand, that they may or may not return, that we have been on our own for millennia, and may remain on our own for millennia more. We would need to confront the question that has haunted every page of this narrative. What happened to them? Where did they go? Why did they leave? And are we what they hoped we would become, or a disappointment they chose to abandon? The Great Pyramid stands in the desert as it has stood since before recorded history, its limestone core exposed where the casing stones were stripped away, its passages dark and silent, its hidden chambers undisturbed. It has survived earthquakes and invasions, the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of religions, the transformation of the world around it from ancient kingdom to modern nation-state. It will likely survive us, will likely stand for millennia after our current civilization has joined the ruins that tourists visit and scholars study. It was built to endure, and it has endured, and it will continue to endure, keeping whatever it was designed to keep until someone chooses to open the chambers that have never been opened, and examine the spaces that have never been examined, and discover what was placed there at the beginning of history, to be found at some unspecified future time. The Sumerian texts describe a world that was not created by humans but inherited by them. A world whose architecture was established before human memory, whose knowledge was given rather than discovered, whose fundamental principles were the ME bestowed by the Anunnaki rather than achievements earned through human effort. The Egyptian texts describe the same pattern with different names: the wisdom of Thoth, the reign of the Neteru, the first time when gods walked openly on earth before withdrawing to their celestial domains. Both traditions describe departure rather than destruction, promise rather than ending, the expectation of return rather than the finality of death. But the return never came, and the silence has lasted 4,000 years, and we are left with monuments we cannot replicate and texts we can only partially decode and questions we cannot answer, because the teachers who could answer them are no longer available to ask. The Great Pyramid contains, according to modern scanning, chambers that have never been opened. Those chambers might contain nothing but dust and darkness, the empty spaces of construction necessity, the disappointing reality that replaces speculation with fact, or they might contain something else, records or artifacts, technology or text, the inheritance that was placed there at the beginning to be recovered at the end, the message that was left for whoever might eventually think to look. We will not know until we choose to look, and we have not yet chosen, and the pyramid waits with the patience of stone for us to make that choice. The question the Anunnaki left us, if they existed, if they built what the texts describe, if they placed in the pyramid what we have not yet found, is the question that every inheritance eventually poses to its recipients: What will you do with what we gave you? Will you maintain it or let it crumble? Will you build upon it or forget it? Will you understand what it was meant to be or reduce it to mythology and speculation? Will you open the chambers or leave them sealed? Will you seek the knowledge or prefer the mystery? The pyramid stands in silence, and the silence is its answer to our questions. It cannot tell us what it contains. It cannot explain what its builders intended. It cannot bridge the gap between the age when it was built and the age in which we study it. It can only stand and wait and preserve whatever it was designed to preserve, and hope, if stone can hope, that someone will eventually recognize what it has been trying to say for 5,000 years. The teachers are gone. The texts remain, fragmentary and interpreted and layered with millennia of elaboration. The structures remain, eroded and studied and never fully understood. And we remain, the descendants of the flood survivors, the inheritors of the post-catastrophe world, the students whose teachers departed before the lesson was complete. We have been on our own for a very long time. We may be on our own for a very long time still, but the pyramid is there, has always been there, will be there long after we are gone, and whatever it contains, whatever the silence has preserved through the ages of human forgetting, waits still for the moment when someone will finally choose to look.